You there? The words cut through the room like a blade through silk, sharp and deliberate. The girl in the back. Stand up. Every head turned in unison, a wave of curiosity and cruelty mixed together. The auditorium held its breath. Hundreds of people filled the ornate theater. Millions more watched the live stream, their phones glowing in darkened rooms across the world. Camera operators swiveled their equipment, hunting for the target of that voice. And one black girl, too young, too small, too invisible by design, froze exactly where she stood. She hadn't volunteered. She hadn't raised her hand during the Q&A portion. She hadn't even made eye contact with the stage. She'd been doing what she always did in spaces like this, making herself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. But the famous singer on stage was smiling now. It was the kind of smile people wear when they already believe they've won, when the game is rigged and they hold all the cards. His teeth were impossibly white. Under the stage lights, his custom suit worth more than her family's car. "Come on up here," he said, his voice carrying that practiced warmth that had sold millions of records. "Don't be shy. Come sing this part alone." He gestured to the microphone with theatrical generosity. "Let's see what you've really got." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. Not cruel laughter, not yet, just the nervous tittering of an audience that senses entertainment coming. Phones lifted, recording lights blinked red. Social media posts were already being drafted in people's minds. "You won't believe what happened at the concert tonight." The anticipation wasn't for brilliance. It was for failure. Everyone in that room could feel it, the way you feel a storm coming before the first drop of rain falls. The girl's hands trembled as she clutched her program. Her mother sat beside her, reaching for her hand, but the girl was already standing, already moving. Because what choice did she have? When someone with that much power calls your name, even when you haven't given it, you answer. She walked down the aisle in her Sunday dress, the one her grandmother had pressed that morning, with hands that shook from arthritis. Each step felt like walking through water. The stage lights were blinding, turning the audience into a sea of shadows and glowing phone screens. What no one in that room knew, what the cameras didn't catch, what the live stream couldn't capture, was that hours earlier, during the sound check she wasn't supposed to witness, the girl had heard something she wasn't supposed to hear. A crack in a legend, a truth wrapped in studio magic and auto-tune, a lie that had been protected by publicists, engineers, and an industry that profits from illusion. She'd been early, sitting in the back row with her music theory homework spread across her lap, when she heard him rehearsing. Really rehearsing. Not the polished performance voice everyone knew from radio and television, but the real voice underneath, the one that strained, the one that cracked, the one that couldn't quite reach the note he was famous for hitting. She'd watched as technicians adjusted equipment, as his vocal coach whispered urgently in his ear, as they ran the track again and again, layering, processing, creating the magic that would convince thousands of people they were hearing something pure. This wasn't a test of her ability. It was a trap. He thought forcing her into the spotlight would erase what she knew. He thought embarrassment would teach her the most important lesson the industry knows. Keep your mouth shut about what happens behind the curtain. He thought a child's humiliation was a small price to pay for protecting a legacy. He was wrong, because when she reached the stage and took the microphone in her trembling hand, when she looked out at that sea of expecting faces, when she felt the weight of his manufactured smile bearing down on her like a physical force, she made a choice, not the choice he expected, not the choice anyone expected. When she opened her mouth to sing, she didn't just hit the note he'd asked for. She hit the truth, and the entire room was about to understand the difference. If you've ever been underestimated, silenced, or made to feel small, hit like and subscribe right now. This channel tells the stories they never wanted you to hear. Her name was Amara, though most people at school just called her the quiet one. She was 14 years old and carried herself like someone who'd learned early that invisibility was safer than attention. She lived in a narrow row house on the east side of the city, where the streets still had cobblestones in places, and the buildings leaned against each other like tired friends. Her bedroom was barely big enough for a twin bed and a desk, but she'd covered one wall entirely with sheet music, some printed, most, handwritten in her careful, tiny script. Music was the language she spoke best. While other kids her age were mastering social media algorithms and friend group politics, Amara was teaching herself to identify intervals by ear, to transcribe melodies from memory, to understand the mathematical relationships between notes that most people experienced only as feeling. Her grandmother said she'd been humming in perfect pitch since she was 2 years old. Her mother said it was a gift. Her father, who'd left when she was 6, had said it was a waste of time that wouldn't pay bills. Maybe he was right. The bills were always there, stacked on the kitchen counter in their yellow and pink envelopes, marked "Final Notice" in red ink that seemed to get brighter and angrier each month. Her mother worked double shifts at the hospital, came home with her scrubs smelling like disinfectant and exhaustion, and still found time to sit on the edge of Amara's bed and ask about her day. "Did you sing today, baby?" she'd ask every single night. And Amara would nod, because she always sang. In the shower, where the acoustics made her voice sound fuller. In the stairwell at school, during lunch when everyone else was in the cafeteria. In the church basement on Thursdays when the choir practiced, and the director let her sit in the back and follow along. She sang because it was the only thing that made sense. The only thing that didn't require her to be louder, bolder, more confident than she felt. Music had rules, clear rules. A half step was always a half step. A perfect fifth was always a perfect fifth. No one could argue with the physics of sound waves. People, on the other hand, were chaos. At school, she ate lunch alone more often than not, her earbuds in, listening to everything from Bach to Beyoncé, analyzing vocal techniques and harmonic structures the way other kids analyzed TikTok trends. The other black girls in her grade had tried to pull her into their orbit freshman year, but Amara's silence had been mistaken for attitude, her shyness for judgment. "You think you're better than us?" Keisha had asked once, not meanly, just genuinely confused. Amara had wanted to explain that it wasn't that. It was just that she didn't know how to be the right kind of black girl, the kind who was effortlessly cool and quick with comebacks and comfortable taking up space. She was the kind who disappeared into sheet music and spent her allowance on voice lesson books she taught herself from. So she'd just shaken her head and said no, and the distance between her and everyone else had grown a little wider. Her voice teacher, if you could call YouTube videos and library books a teacher, was a mix of Maria Callas, Ella Fitzgerald, and a Swedish vocal coach whose technique videos had 147 views. Amara had watched them all multiple times, practicing breathing exercises in her room until her mother knocked on the wall and asked if she was okay. She'd never performed for anyone. Not really. The church choir didn't count because she was hidden in the back row, her voice blending into the collective sound. The school talent show was out of the question. She'd rather die than stand on that stage while her classmates scrolled through their phones and waited for her to finish. But alone in her room, or in those stolen moments in the school stairwell, or in the empty church basement before practice started, that's when her voice came alive. That's when she could hit notes that made her grandmother cry. That's when she could run scales that would make trained vocalists jealous. That's when she could do the things she'd never told anyone about. She could hear a song once and reproduce it perfectly. Every note, every inflection, every breath. Perfect pitch wasn't even the right term for what she had. It was something deeper, something almost supernatural. The contest tickets had been her mother's idea, a birthday present she couldn't afford but bought anyway. charging them to a credit card that was already maxed out. "You need to see greatness," her mother had said, pressing the tickets into Amara's hand. "You need to know what's possible." The singer, Marcus Sterling, was a legend. 5 Grammys, sold-out stadiums, a voice that had defined a generation. He was known for one note in particular, a high tenor note he held for what seemed like impossible lengths, a note that had become his signature, his brand, his identity. Amara had listened to his music for years, had studied his technique, had tried to understand how he did it. And that afternoon, during the sound check she'd stumbled into by arriving too early, she'd finally understood. He didn't do it. Not really. Not without help. And now, walking toward that stage with hundreds of eyes on her back, she understood something else. He knew that she knew. This wasn't about discovering talent. This was about eliminating a witness. Marcus Sterling's face had been on billboards for 15 years. His voice had been the soundtrack to weddings, funerals, first dances, and last goodbyes. 3 generations knew his music. Critics called him the voice of our time. His Wikipedia page was longer than most history textbooks. The legend went like this. A kid from nowhere, discovered singing in a subway station, raw talent so undeniable that a passing producer stopped in his tracks and signed him on the spot. Rags to riches. Proof that in America, if you had the gift, nothing could stop you. It was a good story. Clean, inspiring, perfect for morning show interviews and motivational Instagram posts. It was also mostly bullshit. The real story was more complicated, the way real stories always are. Marcus Sterling had been born Marcus Holloway, son of a moderately successful session musician and a vocal coach who'd worked with several minor recording artists. He'd had training since age 6, professional photos since age 8, manager before he hit puberty. The subway discovery had been staged by a publicity firm his parents had mortgaged their house to hire. The producer who discovered him had been paid to be there. The video that went viral had been edited, processed, and pushed through networks of bot accounts before a single real person ever saw it. But nobody wanted to know that. People wanted the myth, the dream, the possibility that they too could be plucked from obscurity if they just had enough raw talent. And Marcus had been talented. No one could deny that. His young voice had been remarkable, clear, powerful, with a natural vibrato that gave his singing an emotional depth unusual for someone his age. But the music industry doesn't run on remarkable. It runs on perfection, and perfection requires engineering. By his 3rd album, Marcus was spending more time in post-production than in the recording booth. His signature note, that impossible high tenor that people called angelic, that note he was famous for holding for 12 full seconds, was actually 3 separate recordings stitched together, pitch-corrected, and enhanced with harmonic layering. Live performances became increasingly elaborate to hide this fact, backing tracks that were mixed just loud enough to support his voice without being obvious, strategic microphone techniques that made it hard to tell what was live and what was Memorex, arena acoustics designed to flatter rather than reveal. And it had worked. For years, it had worked. His team was excellent. His vocal coach taught him how to mime the note convincingly when he couldn't actually hit it. His sound engineers created layered tracks that could be triggered at precisely the right moments. His publicists killed stories before they started, paid off critics who asked too many questions, and built a fortress of positive press that seemed impenetrable. Marcus himself had started to believe the legend. That's what happens when you're surrounded by people who have a financial interest in your illusion. You begin to forget where the performance ends and the person begins. He'd convinced himself that the technology was just enhancement, not creation. That he could still do it if he had to. That the real him and the produced him weren't that different. Until his voice started to change. Age does things to voices, especially to voices that have been pushed too hard for too long. The constant touring, the shows back-to-back without rest, the pressure to hit the same notes night after night, year after year, it takes a toll. By 32, Marcus's range had shrunk. The high notes that used to come easily now required preparation, warm-up, prayer. The signature note was increasingly out of reach. Some nights in his hotel room practicing alone, he couldn't get close. His team adjusted. More processing, better technology, careful selection of venues with acoustics that helped, a carefully controlled media environment where interviews happened in settings they controlled, where questions about his voice were screened in advance. But technology can only do so much, and there are people in the world who can hear the difference. People with trained ears, people with perfect pitch, people who understand the mathematics of sound well enough to recognize when something doesn't add up. People like Amara. He hadn't known who she was when he'd seen her sitting in the back during sound check that afternoon. Just another kid, probably. Someone's daughter who'd wandered in early. His team should have cleared the venue, but they'd gotten sloppy. Success makes people sloppy. He'd been working on the problematic section of Elevation, the song that ended with his signature note. Takes had been frustrated. His vocal coach had been worried. The sound engineer had been making adjustments, trying to find a technical solution to a physical problem. And then he'd seen her face. She'd been looking at him with an expression he'd learned to recognize over the years. Not admiration, not starstruck wonder, understanding, the kind of understanding that comes from knowledge, not feeling. She knew. He could see it in the way she'd glanced at the sound booth, in the way her eyes had tracked the vocal coach's whispered consultation, in the way she'd closed her notebook with just a little too much force. This girl, this nobody, this child, this person with no power or platform or protection, had stumbled into a truth that his team had spent millions of dollars hiding. And in that moment, watching her gather her things and slip out of the auditorium, Marcus Sterling had felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Because here's the thing about lies. They only work if everyone agrees to believe them. One person speaking truth can unravel everything. So when the show started that night and he saw her sitting in the audience, front section, middle aisle, 5 rows back, he'd made a decision. He would eliminate the problem before it became one. He would use the one weapon that had never failed him, public humiliation. Make her look foolish, make her doubt herself, make her seem unreliable before she ever had a chance to be believed. It was a strategy that had worked for powerful men throughout history. He didn't see any reason why it wouldn't work now. Amara had arrived at the theater 2 hours early because her mother's shift had ended early, and there was no point going home just to turn around and come back. The ticket said doors opened at 6:30, but it was only 4:45, and she'd expected to wait outside. Instead, a side door had been propped open, probably by a crew member taking a smoke break, and curiosity had pulled her inside. The auditorium had been mostly dark, just work lights illuminating the stage. She could hear voices, the thump of equipment being moved, the electronic whine of sound checks. She'd found a seat in the back of the upper deux section, far enough away to be invisible, close enough to see. She'd pulled out her music theory homework, circle of fifths exercises that were due Monday, and was halfway through the second page when she heard it. The voice. Marcus Sterling's voice, live and unprocessed, cutting through the ambient noise. Except it wasn't the voice she knew from recordings. It wasn't even close. He'd been running through Elevation, his most famous song, the one that ended with that impossible note, the one that had defined his career, the one that music critics said proved he was once-in-a-generation talent. But this version was struggling. She could hear the strain in his middle register, the way he was pushing air instead of supporting with his diaphragm. His breathing was off, short gasps between phrases instead of the long, controlled breaths that proper technique required. and then he'd approached the signature note. Amara had leaned forward, pencil forgotten. He'd started the climb, B4, C5, D5, each note requiring more effort than the last. His voice had a slightly different timbre than she was used to, rougher around the edges, missing that crystalline quality that made his recording so distinctive. At E5, he'd wavered, just slightly, but enough that anyone with trained ears would notice. At F5, his voice had cracked. Not badly, not in a way that a casual listener might catch. But Amara's ears weren't casual. She'd heard the break, the moment where his vocal cords couldn't maintain the tension required for the pitch. She'd heard him drop back down, restart, try again. "Take 5, someone had called from the sound booth. "We'll punch it in post." Punch it in post. Studio speak for, "We'll fix it with technology." Her grandmother had taught her about the difference between recorded and live music. "Baby," she'd said, "anybody can sound good with enough buttons and switches. The real test is what comes out when there's nothing between you and the microphone." Amara had watched as Marcus conferred with his vocal coach, a thin woman with severely pulled-back hair who was gesturing at his throat, his stomach, demonstrating breathing techniques he should have mastered years ago. She'd watched the sound engineer pull up waveforms on his computer screen, watched him highlight sections, watched him explain something that made Marcus's jaw tighten with frustration. They'd run it again, this time with backing tracks underneath, thick enough to support his voice, to hide the wobble in his tone, to create the illusion of the power that wasn't quite there. It had sounded better. Still not like the recordings, but better. "We can layer this," the engineer had said, his voice carrying in the empty space. 3 takes, stack them, add some harmonic enhancement. Live. We'll have the track support underneath, and the in-ear monitors will help you hear the pitch. You'll just need to sell it physically. Make it look effortless. Make it look effortless because it wasn't. Amara had felt something crack open in her chest. Not disappointment exactly. She was old enough to know that most things weren't what they seemed. But something like sadness for all the people who believed, who had held this voice up as proof of what was possible, who had practiced for hours trying to recreate a sound that had never existed outside of a computer. She'd written it down in her notebook, not maliciously, just because that's what she did, documented what she heard, analyzed technique, tried to understand. She'd written E5 unstable, F5 break at 47, pitch correction required, backing track support essential, not the voice in recordings. Just facts, just technical observations, the kind she made about every singer she studied. She'd been closing her notebook when she'd felt it, that prickle on the back of your neck when someone is watching you. She'd looked up and met his eyes across the distance of the auditorium. For just a moment, they'd stared at each other, long enough for understanding to pass between them, long enough for her to see the calculation happening behind his famous smile. Then she'd grabbed her things and left, heart pounding, knowing somehow that this wasn't over. She just hadn't known how it would play out. Not until he'd called her name from the stage 4 hours later. Not until she'd understood that this wasn't about music at all. It was about power, about who gets to tell the truth, about what happens when someone with nothing threatens someone with everything. He was going to make her look small, make her look foolish. Make sure that if she ever told anyone what she'd heard, they'd remember this moment and dismiss her as a girl who couldn't even sing when it mattered. It was almost smart. Almost. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Amara had spent her entire life being underestimated, had spent 14 years being invisible, being overlooked, being dismissed as quiet and small and not worth paying attention to. She'd learned to turn invisibility into observation, silence into listening, powerlessness into preparation, and she'd learned something else, something her grandmother had taught her on those nights when the bills seemed insurmountable and the future seemed impossible. Baby, the truth doesn't need volume. It just needs accuracy. So when she took that microphone in her trembling hand, when she looked out at an audience that expected her to fail, when she felt the weight of his manufactured power pressing down on her, she decided to be accurate. The walk to the stage felt like miles. Every step echoed in Amara's ears, mixing with the whispers that rippled through the crowd, the nervous laughter, the shift of hundreds of bodies turning to watch. Marcus Sterling stood in the spotlight with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He looked relaxed, generous even, like he was doing her a favor. Like this was about mentorship, about giving an unknown kid a chance to shine. The audience ate it up. She could see it in their faces as she climbed the side stairs. This was the moment they'd tell their friends about. The time Marcus Sterling pulled a random girl from the audience. So spontaneous, so genuine, so real. Except nothing about this was real. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Marcus asked as she approached, his voice warm and amplified, filling every corner of the space. The microphone he offered felt heavy. Professional equipment, expensive, the kind that didn't forgive mistakes. She took it with both hands. "Amara," she said, and her voice barely registered through the speakers. Someone in the sound booth adjusted levels. Her name echoed back at her from monitors she hadn't known were there. Amara. Beautiful name. Marcus smiled that billboard smile, perfect teeth catching the light. "Do you sing, Amara?" It was a trap disguised as a question. Say yes and you're arrogant, presumptuous, claiming to be something you haven't earned. Say no, and you've already admitted defeat. "Sometimes," she said, the only answer that was true. "Sometimes," he repeated, playing to the crowd. "Well, that's honest. I like that." He turned to the audience, including them in the moment. "Should we see what sometimes sounds like?" The crowd cheered. Of course they did. They had no idea what they were actually watching. To them, this was entertainment. A famous singer being gracious. A girl getting an opportunity. Amara looked past the lights, trying to find her mother in the audience. Found her instead by her sound. A sharp intake of breath that only a daughter could recognize. "Here's what we're going to do," Marcus said, his voice taking on that instructional tone that teachers use when they're setting up a demonstration. "I'm going to sing a phrase, and you're going to repeat it back to me. Think you can handle that?" Another trap. A children's game. Simon Says for Singers. It was designed to make her look childish, simple, untrained. A party trick, not a peer. "Just follow along," he continued. "Match the pitch, match the rhythm. Nothing too complicated." He glanced at his band, at his musical director. Something passed between them. A signal she couldn't quite read. The audience was fully invested now. Phones were recording. This would be on YouTube within the hour, TikTok within minutes. Whatever happened next would follow her forever. Marcus sang a simple phrase. 4 notes. Nothing complex. A descending major scale fragment in a comfortable register. G4, F4, E4, D4. "Here we go," he sang. She repeated it back. "Here we go." Her voice came out clear despite her nerves. Years of practicing alone had taught her control even under pressure. The notes were exact, the rhythm tight. She saw something flicker in his eyes. Not quite surprise. He'd expected basic competence, but perhaps a recalculation. "Good," he said, nodding. "Let's try. Something a little higher." Another phrase, still simple but up a third. B4, A4, G4, F4. "Climb with me." "Climb with me," she echoed. Her voice was stronger this time. The acoustics of the room were better than any space she'd practiced in. She could hear herself clearly through the monitors, could adjust in real time. The notes felt solid under her, like stepping stones she knew wouldn't wobble. The audience's energy changed. The anticipatory laughter faded. People were actually listening now. Marcus felt it too. She could see it in the way his posture shifted, in the tightness that crept into his shoulders. This wasn't going exactly as planned. "You've got some training," he said. Not a question, almost an accusation. "I practice," she said simply. "Where?" "Anywhere I can." The truth of that statement hung in the air. Anywhere I can. Stairwells, shower stalls, empty rooms. All the spaces where girls like her had to steal moments to develop gifts that girls like her weren't supposed to have. Marcus's smile hardened at the edges. "Well, let's really test that practice. Let's see what you can do with something challenging." There it was, the shift, the moment the pretense of mentorship fell away, and this became what it had always been, a public execution. He glanced at his musical director again, nodded. The band began to play. Not one of his songs, something classical, operatic, a piece with a famous soprano line that climbed into territories most singers never attempted. "The Queen of the Night aria," someone in the audience murmured. "From the Magic Flute." Amara knew it. Of course she knew it. She'd studied it, practiced it in pieces, never imagining she'd attempt the full thing. It was a showpiece for trained opera singers, for sopranos who'd spent decades developing the technique required to hit those stratospheric notes cleanly. It was also, she realized, brilliant strategy. Give her something impossible, something she couldn't possibly do, something so far beyond her experience that her failure would be complete, undeniable, and permanent. When she bombed this, and how could she not, any credibility she might have had would evaporate. If she ever tried to tell people what she'd heard during soundcheck, they'd remember. Oh, that girl who couldn't even sing when Marcus Sterling gave her a chance. That girl who choked on stage in front of thousands of people. Her hands were shaking. The microphone felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Marcus leaned in, his back to the audience, so only she could see his expression. The kindness had evaporated entirely. "Careful, sweetheart," he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Some things are better left unheard." It wasn't just a warning about the aria. It was a warning about the truth. And in that moment, standing under lights hot enough to burn, surrounded by thousands of watching eyes, holding a microphone connected to speakers that would broadcast every crack, every wobble, every failure, Amara made a decision. She'd spent 14 years making herself small. She was done. The introduction played, violins climbing in urgent scales, building tension. Every musician in the band knew what was coming. Every trained ear in the audience knew. The Queen of the Night aria was famous not just for its difficulty, but for its exposure. There was nowhere to hide, no way to fake it. Amara closed her eyes for just a second, long enough to hear her grandmother's voice. "Baby, the truth doesn't need volume. It just needs accuracy." When she opened them, something had shifted. The fear was still there. She wasn't stupid. She knew what she was attempting. But underneath it was something else, something harder, certainty. She'd been practicing her whole life for this moment, hadn't she? Every empty stairwell, every shower performance, every night singing along to recordings, matching pitch for pitch, analyzing. Technique, understanding not just what to do, but why. The aria began in a register that was actually comfortable for her, middle soprano range, around G4. The German lyrics felt foreign on her tongue, but she'd listened to enough recordings to know the pronunciation. More importantly, she knew the emotional architecture of the piece, a mother's fury, her desperation, her command. She sang the first phrase. Her voice cut through the space with unexpected power. Not loud. She wasn't pushing, but clear, direct. No wobble, no uncertainty. Just the note, pure and true. The audience reaction was immediate. The energy in the room changed from anticipatory mockery to genuine attention. People stopped looking at their phones. The whispers quieted. Marcus's smile tightened. The aria progressed, each phrase built on the last, climbing higher, requiring more technical control. Amara focused on her breathing, deep, supported from her diaphragm, the way she'd taught herself from YouTube videos and library books. She thought about the physics of it. Air pressure, vocal cord tension, resonance chambers in her skull and chest. At B4, her voice was still solid, strong, even. At C5, she felt the shift required. Not pushing harder, but adjusting the shape of her mouth, the position of her soft palate, allowing the sound to place itself in the mask of her face. At D5, some of the trained musicians in the band glanced at each other. This was the point where most amateur singers started to struggle, where the voice got thin or strident, where technique broke down under pressure. Amara's voice soared through it cleanly. She could see Marcus's jaw tighten, see his hand clench at his side. This wasn't going according to plan. The aria continued its relentless climb. E5, F5, the notes he'd struggled with that afternoon. The notes that had required pitch correction and layered backing tracks. Amara hit them with a clarity that made them ring in the acoustics of the hall. She wasn't just singing the aria. She was singing the truth she'd heard that afternoon. Every clean note was evidence. Every clear tone was proof. And then came the descent and the famous coloratura runs, rapid-fire sequences of notes that sounded like a vocal instrument reaching the edge of human capability. Scales that moved faster than speech, requiring absolute precision and control. She'd practiced these sections slowly, note by note, building speed over months until her vocal cords could execute the patterns without conscious thought. In her bedroom, it had sounded impressive but private. A secret skill nobody would ever hear. Here, amplified, in perfect acoustics, with an audience that now understood they were witnessing something unexpected. It sounded impossible. The runs came out like liquid silver, each note distinct and intentional, not blurred together but articulated with precision that trained sopranos spent years developing. Her breath control was perfect. She'd planned the phrases carefully, knew exactly where to steal air without breaking the musical line. The audience had gone completely silent. Not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of awe. Marcus Sterling stood 3 feet away from her, frozen. His famous face was doing calculations she could almost see. This wasn't a girl stumbling through something beyond her capability. This wasn't a child he could dismiss. This was someone who could hear the difference between real and processed. Someone who could reproduce complexity with accuracy. Someone whose ear was trained enough to know exactly what she'd witnessed that afternoon. Someone dangerous. The first section of the aria ended. There was a brief instrumental interlude before the famous second section, the part with the F6, the note that existed at the absolute upper edge of the soprano range. The note that only a handful of singers in the world could hit cleanly. The note that would be according to Marcus's plan, where she finally failed. Amara took a breath. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady now. The fear had burned away, leaving only focus. She looked directly at Marcus, held his gaze, and she understood what he saw. A girl who'd spent her whole life being underestimated, who'd learned to turn invisibility into observation, who'd practiced alone in empty spaces until she could do things people assumed were impossible. A girl who was about to hit notes he'd never cleanly managed in his entire career. The interlude ended. The impossible section began. The aria's second section opened with the orchestra building to a crescendo, a musical warning that something extreme was approaching. The melody climbed like a ladder, reaching towards something most voices couldn't touch. Amara's training kicked in with the automaticity of muscle memory. She adjusted her stance slightly, ensuring her breath support was optimal. She felt the note waiting ahead of her like a destination on a map she'd studied for years. The phrase began at E5, already higher than most untrained singers could comfortably access. She moved through it with increasing confidence. F5, G5, each note clear and resonant. The acoustics of the theater carried her voice to every corner, revealing the purity of her tone without any processing or technological assistance. In the wings, she could sense the stage crew stopping their work to listen. The band members were no longer just playing. They were accompanying with the kind of focused attention professional musicians reserve for peers, not for random audience members pulled on stage as props. The coloratura passages accelerated, G5 to E5 and back, rapid oscillations that required vocal cords to adjust tension within milliseconds. Her months of slow practice, building speed incrementally paid off. The notes came out as distinct pearls on a string, not the blurred runs that marked amateur attempts. And then the music approached. The moment, the high F6. In the original opera, this note was held for several measures, a demonstration of absolute vocal mastery that separated true sopranos from merely good ones. It sat at 1396 Hz, a frequency so high it was closer to a piccolo than to human speech. Marcus Sterling had built his career on a note a full octave below this. His famous F5, 1175 Hz, had been difficult enough that he now required technological assistance to reach it consistently. Amara was about to attempt F6, live, unassisted, in front of thousands of witnesses. She could feel Marcus watching her, waiting for the break, the crack, the moment when biology would assert itself and prove she was just another kid with dreams bigger than her capability. The orchestra hit the chord. The moment arrived. Amara opened her mouth and sang. The note came out pure, not strained, not forced, released with the kind of control that comes from understanding rather than just attempting. Her breath support was absolute, her vocal cords vibrating at precisely the right tension, the resonance placing in her head voice with bell-like clarity. F6, held for 2 measures, clean as crystal. The audience gasped, actually gasped, a collective intake of breath that was audible even over the orchestra. She saw Marcus's face cycle through disbelief, recognition, and something very close to panic. Because here's what that note proved. She wasn't just a girl who could sing. She was a girl with perfect pitch, with technique that rivaled professionals, with an ear trained enough to hear the difference between real and manufactured. A girl who absolutely, definitely, undeniably had heard what she'd heard that afternoon, and who now had an entire theater full of people who'd just witnessed that she knew what she was talking about. The aria continued. More impossibly high notes, more rapid coloratura, more demonstrations of a capability that shouldn't have existed in a 14-year-old who'd taught herself from library books and YouTube videos. She executed every phrase, not perfectly. She was human, nervous. This wasn't a controlled environment, but more than well enough. Well enough that the musicians in the band were exchanging looks of genuine respect. Well enough that the audience had stopped seeing a random girl and started seeing a singer. Well enough that Marcus Sterling's carefully constructed trap had become his own exposure. The final phrase approached. Traditionally, sopranos ended the aria with one last ascent to F6, holding it triumphantly while the orchestra crashed around them in climactic celebration. Amara prepared. This was it. The final statement, the last word. She climbed. E5, F5, A5, C6. And then, instead of stopping at F6, she did something the aria didn't call for, something Mozart hadn't written, something that existed purely as a technical exercise in the highest reaches of the soprano range. She went to G6, 1568 Hz, a note so high it was barely within human vocal range, a note that only a handful of singers in the world could hit, a note that existed in the realm of whistle, register, where normal vocal technique ended and something almost superhuman began. A note Marcus Sterling had never come close to in his entire career. She hit it, held it, let it ring in the perfect acoustics of the theater. Then she stopped. Let the orchestra finish. and lowered the microphone. The silence that followed was absolute. Then someone started clapping, then another, then the entire audience erupted. But Amara wasn't looking at the audience. She was looking at Marcus Sterling. His face had gone through shock and landed somewhere near rage, because he understood what had just happened. She hadn't just survived his trap, she'd turned it into a demonstration. Proof not just that she could sing, but that she could hear, could analyze, could understand at a level that made her testimony about what she'd witnessed that afternoon completely credible. He'd wanted to discredit her before she could speak. Instead, he'd given her a platform and an audience, and she'd used it to hit notes he'd never managed without help. The band was applauding now, the crew in the wings, even his own musical director was staring at her with something like wonder. Marcus forced his smile back into place, took his microphone, addressed the audience with a voice that almost covered the tightness underneath. "Well," he said, "that was unexpected." The audience laughed, thinking it was generous praise. Only Amara heard the threat in it. The applause continued, wave after wave of sound that filled the auditorium like a physical force. Amara stood in the center of it, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, her breath coming quick and shallow. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. But as the reality of the moment settled over her, she understood that done wasn't quite right. She hadn't finished something. She'd started something. Marcus Sterling stepped closer, his arm moving as if to put it around her shoulders in a gesture of congratulations. She stepped back instinctively. The movement was small, but cameras caught it. His arm froze mid-gesture, awkward and exposed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning to play to the audience, recovering with practiced ease. "Please give it up one more time for Amara." More applause. But Amara noticed something in the front rows, the VIP section where critics, industry professionals, and invited guests sat. They weren't just clapping politely. They were leaning toward each other, having urgent conversations. Phones were out, not filming, but typing, making notes, sending messages. The music industry was small, word traveled fast, and what they'd just witnessed would be analyzed, discussed, and dissected before the night was over. "How about we get you back to your seat?" Marcus said, his smile bright and his voice low enough that the microphone barely caught it. "Your mother must be so proud." The mention of her mother was deliberate, a reminder that he knew where she sat, that he could find her, that there were consequences for daughters who stepped too far out of line. But before Amara could move, someone else stepped onto the stage. A woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested authority earned through decades. She wore a lanyard that identified her as press, and she moved with the confidence of someone who had every right to be where she was. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Simone Marcus, Classical Voice Magazine. Marcus, would you mind if I asked Amara a few questions? That was quite an extraordinary performance." Marcus's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "I think she's had enough excitement for one night." "I'd like to," Amara heard herself say. Her voice came out stronger than she expected. "I can answer questions." This woman, Simone, gave her an appraising look that felt different from the audience's stares. This was professional assessment, not entertainment. "Where did you train?" "I didn't. Not formally. I taught myself." A murmur ran through the audience. Simone's eyebrows rose. "You taught yourself the Queen of the Night aria? That's highly unusual." "I had recordings and books, and I practiced." "How long have you been singing?" "Since I could talk, according to my grandmother." "But seriously, maybe 6 years." "And you have perfect pitch?" It wasn't really a question. Anyone with trained ears could hear that she did. "Yes, ma'am." Simone nodded slowly. Then she turned to Marcus with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Marcus, that was quite a risk, putting an untrained singer on stage like that. What made you single her out?" The question was innocent on its surface, but Amara could hear the edge under it. Simone had been in the industry long enough to smell a setup. Just felt right, Marcus said smoothly. I like to give opportunities to young talent when I can. And you chose one of the most difficult pieces in the soprano repertoire as her test? I wanted to see what she could do. Well, she clearly can do quite a lot. Simone turned back to Amara. Tell me, dear, have you ever heard Marcus perform live before tonight? The question hung in the air, like a lit fuse looking for dynamite. Amara felt the weight of the moment. She could lie. She could say no. She could let this whole thing pass as a weird coincidence, go home, live her small life, never make waves. Or she could tell the truth. She looked at Marcus, saw the warning in his eyes, the threat, the promise of consequences. Then she looked at Simone, saw something else there. Not warning, but recognition. The look of someone who'd been in the industry long enough to know when something didn't add up. Someone who might actually listen. I was here this afternoon, Amara said quietly. During sound check, I heard him rehearsing. The atmosphere changed instantly. Marcus's face went carefully neutral, but his hand clenched at his side. Simone's eyes sharpened. Did you now? And what did you hear? This was it. The moment. The choice. I heard him working on elevation, Amara said. Her voice was quiet, but the microphone caught every word. The part with his signature note. He was having trouble reaching it. They had to use pitch correction and backing tracks. The silence that followed was different from the silence after her performance. That had been awe. This was shock. That's absurd, Marcus said, his voice hardening. She's a child making up stories because she wants attention. I heard specific frequencies, Amara continued, and now her training showed in a different way. The F5 broke at 47 seconds into the phrase. He dropped down to E5, then tried again. The vocal coach was working with him on breath support. The engineer said they'd punch it in post and layer 3 takes together. The technical specificity of her description was damning. These weren't vague accusations. They were detailed observations that only someone with perfect pitch and musical training could make. Several audience members were recording now, not for entertainment anymore, for documentation. You know what I think? Marcus said, his voice taking on an edge that his publicists would later scramble to explain away. I think this is a setup. I think you planted yourself here, learned that piece, probably had coaching also. You could get on stage and make these ridiculous accusations, then prove her wrong, Simone said calmly. Sing the note, right now, live, no backing track, no processing, just you and the microphone. The challenge was so simple, so direct, that Marcus couldn't immediately dismiss it without looking like he was hiding something. I don't have to prove anything to you, he said. No, you don't, Simone agreed. But you built a career on that note. Surely it wouldn't be difficult to demonstrate it one more time. The audience was completely silent now, watching, waiting. Marcus looked around at the faces staring up at him. Hundreds of people who had paid money to see him perform, who had believed in his legend, who were now watching that legend develop cracks in real time. This is absurd, he said finally. I'm not going to participate in some kind of ambush. It's not an ambush, Simone said. It's just a note. The note you're famous for. The note this young woman just surpassed by a full octave. The comparison was brutal and accurate. Marcus's carefully controlled expression finally cracked. My voice is tired from the performance. Amara's voice should be tired too, Simone pointed out. She just sang one of the most demanding arias in the repertoire. Yet I'd be willing to bet she could sing that F5 right now without difficulty. All eyes turned to Amara. She looked at the microphone in her hand, then at Marcus, then at Simone. She could let this go. Should, probably. She'd made her point, proved her capability. This was enough, but her grandmother's voice echoed in her head again. The truth doesn't need volume. It just needs accuracy. She lifted the microphone, took a breath, and sang a pure, clean F5 that rang in the space without wavering. Held it for 5 seconds, 6, 7, then stopped. The proof was irrefutable. Marcus Sterling turned and walked off the stage without another word. His band watched him go, uncertainty written across their faces. And Amara stood alone in the spotlight, a 14-year-old girl who'd just demolished a legend with nothing but truth and a voice that wouldn't lie. The stage manager found her in the wings 20 minutes later, still holding the microphone she'd forgotten to put down. The applause had eventually stopped. The audience had filed out in clusters, phones glowing, conversations urgent and animated. The theater was nearly empty now, except for crew members breaking down equipment and a handful of journalists who'd stayed behind, hoping for interviews. "You need to go," the stage manager said, not unkindly but firmly. "Security is going to clear the building." Amara nodded. Her hands were still shaking. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance had drained away, leaving her feeling hollow and exhausted. Her mother found her before she made it to the door, pulled her into a hug so tight it hurt. "Baby," she whispered. "Baby, what did you do?" It wasn't a criticism. It was wonder and fear mixed together, the sound a mother makes when her child has just jumped off a cliff and somehow grown wings on the way down. "I sang," Amara said simply. "You did more than sing." Her mother pulled back, held her at arm's length, studied her face. "You started something." Before Amara could respond, a man in an expensive suit appeared beside them, early 40s, carefully groomed, the kind of person who looked like they charged by the minute for their time. "Mrs. Williams, I'm David Chen, entertainment attorney. I'd like to talk to you about representation for your daughter." "We don't need," her mother started. "Yes, you do," David said, not unkindly. "By tomorrow morning, this video will have millions of views. Marcus Sterling's team will be in damage control mode. They'll come after the narrative, and they'll come after Amara. You need someone who can protect her legally. We can't afford pro bono, at least initially. That performance was the most extraordinary thing I've seen in 20 years in this industry. I want to make sure she has protection." More people approached. A talent scout from a major label, a vocal coach who offered free lessons, a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell Amara's story, a representative from a prestigious performing arts high school offering a full scholarship. Each card pressed into her mother's hand felt like a weight, like proof that the life they'd known had ended the moment Amara had hit that first clean note. Simone from Classical Voice magazine appeared through the crowd. "Can I have a moment?" Amara's mother looked ready to refuse, but Amara nodded. There was something about this woman that felt different from the others circling. They found a quiet corner backstage. Simone sat down on an equipment case, gestured for Amara to do the same. "That was brave," Simone said. "And stupid, but mostly brave. I just told the truth. The truth destroys careers, sweetheart, especially when the career belongs to someone with money and power in lawyers." Simone pulled out her phone, showed Amara a screen. "This is already trending. #Marcus Sterling exposed. #Amara Williams. #VocalGate. By morning, every major news outlet will have picked it up." Amara felt her stomach drop. "I didn't mean to." "Yes, you did. You meant to tell the truth, and the truth has consequences." Simone's expression softened slightly. "I've been covering music for 30 years. I've known about Marcus's assistants for a while. Most of us in the industry have. But there's knowing, and there's proving. You just proved it in front of thousands of witnesses. What happens now? Now, Marcus's team goes into crisis mode. They'll try to discredit you, say you're lying, Say you were coached. Say this was all staged. They'll hire voice analysts to create alternate explanations for what people heard. They'll flood the zone with counter-narratives. They have millions of dollars and a team of experts whose entire job is protecting his image. And me? You have the truth. And a cell phone video that's about to be seen by millions of people. Simone paused. The question is, what do you want to do with that? Amara thought about her bedroom with its wall of sheet music. Her morning routine of trying to be invisible at school. Her mother's double shifts and the bills marked final notice. The small, quiet life that had been safe because it was unnoticed. That life was gone now. There was no going back. I don't want to be famous, she said quietly. I just want to sing. I know, but those might not be separable anymore. Simone stood up, handed Amara a business card. Call me if you need someone who understands the industry but isn't trying to profit from you. And Amara, get a lawyer, today if possible. Marcus Sterling didn't build his empire by playing nice with people who threaten it. After Simone left, Amara and her mother made their way to the parking lot. The night air was cool after the heat of the stage lights. Amara's throat felt raw, her voice hoarse from the extremes she'd pushed it to. Her mother's car was a 20-year-old sedan that coughed when it started. They sat in silence as it warmed up, the engine ticking. Are you angry? Amara finally asked. Angry? Baby, I'm terrified. I'm proud. I'm confused. I'm all of it at once. Her mother's hands gripped the steering wheel even though the car wasn't moving. You were incredible up there. You were everything I always knew you could be. But I'm scared of what comes next. Me too. We'll figure it out, her mother said, more to herself than to Amara. We always do. But as they drove home through streets that suddenly felt different, like the whole world had tilted on its axis in the last 2 hours, Amara looked at her phone and saw it was already starting. The texts, the messages, friend requests from strangers, her social media notifications climbing into the thousands. And one message that made her blood run cold. From an unknown number. You made a mistake tonight. Smart girls know when to stay quiet. No signature. No threat explicit enough to take to police. Just a warning, wrapped in ice. Her mother's phone buzzed. Then again. Again. What is it? Amara asked. Her mother's face had gone pale in the dashboard light. The hospital. They're saying there's been a complaint about my performance, that I'm under review, that I might be suspended pending an investigation. The message was clear. They couldn't hurt Amara directly. She was a minor, and the video of her performance was too public, too positive. But her mother was vulnerable. This is because of me, Amara whispered. No. Her mother's voice was fierce. This is because of them, because powerful people don't like being exposed, because the truth is more dangerous than they want it to be. They drove the rest of the way home in silence. Inside their narrow row house, everything looked the same, but Amara knew it wasn't. Nothing would ever be the same again. She'd hit a note that Marcus Sterling couldn't reach, and now the whole world was watching to see what would happen next. The video hit 10 million views by morning. Amara woke to her phone buzzing with notifications, hundreds, then thousands, then too many to count. Her mother had turned off her own phone around 3 a.m., after the 20th call from reporters requesting interviews. The living room had been transformed overnight. David Chen, the entertainment lawyer who'd approached them, had made good on his promise and arrived at 7 a.m. with a colleague, a media consultant, and enough paperwork to fill their kitchen table. We need to talk about controlling the narrative, David said, pouring coffee from a thermos he'd brought. Marcus Sterling's team released a statement an hour ago. He pulled up his tablet, showed them the official response posted on all of Marx's social media platforms. Last night, I had the privilege of sharing the stage with a talented young singer. While I'm thrilled to see young people interested in music, I'm disappointed by attempts to create controversy where none exists. The music industry uses technology to enhance live performances. This is standard practice and well known. Any suggestions otherwise are misunderstandings by those unfamiliar with professional production. I wish Amara all the best in her journey. It was masterful. Acknowledge the performance. Dismiss the accusation as ignorance. Frame himself as the gracious professional dealing with an overeager amateur who didn't understand how the industry worked. He's trying to make you look naive, the media consultant, a woman named Rashida, explained. Like you mistook standard production techniques for deception. But that's not what happened, Amara said. I heard him struggle with the note. I heard them discuss pitch correction. We know. The problem is proving it. David pulled up another screen. They've already got voice analysts on morning shows explaining how backup tracks and enhancement are normal, how every live performer uses them, how this doesn't mean Marcus can't hit those notes. Can we get our own analysts? Amara's mother asked. We can, but here's the thing. They're right the technology is used in live performance. They're just wrong about the degree. Marcus isn't enhancing his voice. He's replacing it. But proving that distinction to a public that doesn't understand audio engineering? David shook his head. That's harder. So what do we do? Amara asked. Rashida leaned forward. We focus on what can't be disputed. Your performance. You sang the Queen of the Night aria, one of the most difficult pieces in classical music, live and unassisted. You hit notes beyond what Marcus claims to hit. That's not subjective. That's documented fact. But they're saying I must have had training, Amara pointed out, that there's no way I taught myself. Then we show them, Rashida said. We tell your story. The practice in stairwells and shower stalls, the library books and YouTube videos, the wall of sheet music in your bedroom. We make you relatable but extraordinary. The girl who did the impossible through sheer determination. It felt calculated, strategic, like they were building a brand instead of just telling the truth. I don't want to be a brand, Amara said quietly. I just wanted to sing. I know, David said, his voice gentler, but you became something else the moment that video went viral. Now we have to decide what that something is before Marcus's team decides for you. The doorbell rang, then rang again, then someone knocked. Hard. Through the front window, Amara could see news vans parked on their narrow street, reporters with cameras, neighbors standing on porches, watching. We'll handle this, Rashida said, standing. Don't go outside. Don't answer the door. Don't post anything on social media without checking with us first. Over the next week, Amara watched her story become a commodity. Classical Voice magazine published Simone's first-hand account, carefully noting every technical detail of the performance. The article went viral in music education circles, shared by vocal coaches and opera singers who recognized the legitimacy of what they'd witnessed, but mainstream media was more interested in the drama, the David versus Goliath narrative. The untrained black girl taking down a powerful white celebrity, the controversy over technological deception in live performance. Marcus Sterling didn't comment further, but his team was everywhere. Voice analysts appearing on morning shows, industry insiders explaining that everyone does this. Social media campaigns suggesting Amara had been coached, that the whole thing was a setup, that she was being manipulated by people trying to destroy a good man's career. Some of it worked. A portion of the public believed Marcus was being unfairly attacked. His core fans rallied around him, pointing out his decades of success, his charity work, his influence on a generation of musicians. But something else was happening too. Other people started coming forward, session musicians who'd worked on Marcus's albums, willing to describe exactly how much pitch correction had been used, a former sound engineer who still had original, unprocessed recordings, a backup singer who'd been fired after questioning the gap between studio and live performances. The dam that had held for years was breaking, and it wasn't just about Marcus Sterling anymore. Major artists began admitting to using auto-tune in live shows. Award committees started discussing new rules about what constituted live performance. Music schools began having conversations about the difference between technological enhancement and technological dependence. And in the center of it all was a 14-year-old girl who just wanted to sing. The scholarship offers piled up. Juilliard, Berkeley, conservatories across Europe, performance opportunities with symphonies, opera companies, even pop producers who wanted to find the right sound for her voice. Amara turned them all down. "I'm not ready," she told David when he looked at her like she was insane for refusing opportunities people would kill for. "I need to learn more. I need to get better." "You hit a G6 live on stage," he said. "How much better can you get?" "I got lucky," she said simply. "I had adrenaline and anger and fear, but I don't actually know what I'm doing. I need real training. I need time." In the end, she accepted one offer, a full scholarship to a prestigious performing arts high school with a focus on vocal performance. Not because it was the most famous or would get her the most publicity, but because their program emphasized technique over performance, understanding over fame. She would learn properly, build a foundation, become the singer she'd only pretended to be on that stage. Her mother kept her job. The hospital's investigation had been quietly dropped after David made it clear they were prepared to sue for retaliation. The bills still came, but now there were calls from foundations offering financial assistance, from organizations that helped families of young artists. Marcus Sterling's career didn't end. Careers like his rarely do. Too much money invested, too many people dependent on the ecosystem he'd built. But it changed. His next tour was smaller. His next album's sales were lower. And he never again claimed to hit that note live. 6 months after that night, Amara was sitting in a practice room at her new school, working through vocal exercises with a teacher who actually knew what she was doing, learning about breath support and placement and technique from someone who could explain not just what to do, but why. Her phone buzzed. Another interview request, probably. Or another offer. They still came regularly, though less frequently now that she'd made it clear she wasn't interested in immediate fame. But this message was different. From Simone. "Thought you'd want to know." Marcus Sterling just announced his retirement from touring, saying he wants to focus on production and mentorship. "Between you and me, his label dropped him. The insurance companies won't cover performances without technical support clauses that basically admit he can't do it live." You didn't just expose one singer's deception, Amara. You changed the industry's standards. People are asking questions now, demanding authenticity. You hit a note he couldn't reach, and it resonated further than either of you knew it would. I hope you're proud. I hope you're okay. And I hope you're still singing. Amara read the message twice, then set her phone down and returned to her scales. She was singing, would always be singing. But now she was doing it with purpose, not to prove anything to anyone, not to expose lies or destroy careers, but because the truth had always been simple. Some voices can't be silenced. Some notes demand to be heard. And sometimes the smallest person in the room has the biggest thing to say. She opened her mouth and sang a pure, clear middle C, then built from there, one note at a time, each one true.